Probably does, but it's okay. Yeah, the talk actually isn't about nonprofit DAOs, but it is also a governance talk. We've been moving things around. Hopefully everyone's okay with that. So this talk is called Autonomy and Self-Governing Systems, and I guess the context is well, I think a lot of the talks later today are by projects building on top of Polkadot, and we are one of those. We're Commonwealth, and we work on Edgeware, which is a smart contract chain on top of Polkadot. But if we go to a world where Polkadot is extremely successful, and there are a huge number of chains in the world, each of them standing up on their own, each of them with their own users, developers, constituents, what does that world look like, and how can we build governance in a way that maximally enables that world to really just work out? And the title of the talk is a reference to that because each of those is kind of its own autonomous self-governing system. And in 2019, we're seeing the first examples of these real governance experiments showing up. We are super early in this process, but it is, I think, an incredibly exciting future for a lot of us, because if we unlock how to do governance really well at many different layers, at the base layer with Polkadot, at the parachain layer, at the application layer, then that means we will have massively increased our ability to build a whole new class of software at many different levels. A bunch of the first examples of these governance systems have shown up, and we've seen the first AGP vote, we have seen Humanity DAO, Maker voting, DXDAO, and I think it's at this stage in the process, it's still clear that it's actually super early. So this is kind of like an exciting day one for the whole process. Edgeware, I mentioned. So we build a smart contract chain called Edgeware. It is built on Substrate. It is self-funding using the Treasury Module. It is fairly similar to Polkadot in a bunch of ways, reuses many of the same core concepts, democracy, council, etc. Unlike Polkadot, we're launching this through a new experimental mechanism called lock drop. So some of you may know about that. It is an event where anybody can time lock or signal their ETH, and by doing so, gain a stake in the new network. I think the aim of this is to reward holders of Ethereum who are interested in participating in this active governance experiment and launching a new kind of chain that really is extremely different from Ethereum. And Commonwealth is the name of the company that is kind of initially putting this together, but will only be a very small minority shareholder in the chain when it launches. And what Commonwealth does and is trying to solve is governance, and how do we make that process accessible and easy to a large number of people. So far, out of the systems we've seen go live, we have a huge number of validator governed systems. We have a bunch of systems that are governed by a fairly small minority of people. If you look at the votes that have happened so far on blockchain systems, the Aragon, MakerDAO, etc., most of those are actually seeing fairly low turnout, fairly high centralization. A very small number of people who are in the know care enough to vote. And plutocracy, maybe. Coin voting is controversial. I think it is definitely something that could be very important and is an extremely useful design element. Depending on who you talk to, depending on how the economic distributions of these chains work out, I think there's an argument that could really be valid, which is that if you have a stakeholder owning a huge portion of a chain, or a special class of stakeholders that are wealthier than others, building your governance around coin voting is really entrenching the power structure and further exacerbating, potentially not the world that we want to move into. So our answer to that, or really our kind of evolution of that dialogue with Edgeware is, so we've kept it fairly simple. What we're launching is the WebAssembly smart contracts chain with a few governance-focused add-ons, an identity module which lets people register identities and makes those accessible on-chain, and a signaling module which I think is an addition to the base Polkadot governance system, where the purpose is really to empower this really large base of token holders who have entered through the lock drop to do things that, the Polkadot itself, where many participants have been long-term involved in the community, and our dot holders and our validators might be able to get by without. But I think when you've got a community which is more diffuse and more spread out, and potentially more widely distributed, then giving people more governance tools in order to let them kind of accomplish their goals it kind of is the aim of this signaling and voting module. So the Edgeware Chain is kind of the themes behind it. It is we're gonna do a few things with the governance process and the chain that aim to really explore the boundaries of what we can do with a democratic governance system. One of them is Edgeware is going to constantly mint tokens into the Treasury, and those tokens will be distributed to people who develop on the chain. The goal is over time, the distribution of Edge goes to ETH holders, but over time it will increase. More people have access to Edge. There are many different ways to access and become part of this network, and that will increase the amount of distribution that the chain has, and it'll increase the amount of people who have access to enough meaningful stake in the network who can participate in its governance. Some other themes here are emergent behavior. Commonwealth is a super small team. The other people we work with, at Parity, who are building the base layer for this, other people who are working with us on launching the chain are not spending, we're not like a huge team that has assembled a massive cast of developers and designers and architects in order to put this together. Can emergent behavior create a whole process here where people are rewarded and the whole network can collectively vote on making the right decisions and moving the chain forward? And in the long term, if that works out, I think we'll want to port those practices to other places. This is a base layer web smart contracts chain, but can we use that to govern other processes? Can we use that to govern things like DAOs and nonprofits, or other specific forms of web infrastructure that sit in particular places that relatively small numbers of people care about? So I think something that could be useful for us to kind of walk through is how we are thinking about the governance of this system, and really a little bit slightly different, more in-depth in certain ways, exploration of all of the different modules, Polkadot governance or Edgeware governance focused. The democracy module. So, for example, one of the interesting things that Gav mentioned earlier today, and that we're looking at, is the democracy module operates a little bit differently than how a lot of governance-focused networks do right now. There is this 2-week rhythm to proposal launches, and all proposals kind of compete for that slot. So you can have a proposal that either comes in from the public, or you can have one that comes in from the council, and the most strongly backed proposal, or the first backed proposal from the council, will move up to the top, and that's the one that actually gets launched and queued and put up for people to vote on. This is pretty interesting to us because we think it reduces the amount of attention that people need in order to participate in governance by a pretty huge amount. 2 weeks is pretty frequent. That might change with governance over time and be even, it might be even a larger interval between proposal launches. But knowing that you have a proposal that launched in a week, you think that a proposal is going to launch at a certain time, you have 2 weeks to make up your mind on what you think about it and coordinate with other people, and you are not being distracted by other things going on and don't have to think about multiple different pieces interacting, means that you can potentially direct your attention towards governing a much larger surface area of projects. Other things that are happening here, Substrate, we're using Substrate, we're using the same private key infrastructure, the same ED25519 and SR25019 keys. Right now, one of the biggest obstacles we've noticed people have is that taking private keys out of storage is very difficult, and that deters a huge number of people from participating in governance. So proxies and delegation help change that. Something super basic, but I think it'll be pretty important. The council is, we've talked about the rotating approval system, which Kusama won't be using, but we're going to use probably the existing approval voting system. We have a pretty diverse token holder base, and so over time we'll see users rotate in, and basically what the council kind of does is, so there's 2 kinds of authority on the network. For us, we don't have a technical collective. The coin holder-based authority is, large amounts of that are held by major ETH holders and people who are, institutions accustomed to holding like significant amounts of economic power. The council gives people a way to, or makes the system translate that power into a different form, which is community authority. If you are a developer who's trusted and part of the system, who's been with Edgeware or with working on Substrate for a long time, then you can run for a council seat, and that gives you a form of power and a voice in the network that is totally different than the kind you would acquire by being a major token holder. It is kind of up to the token holders to assemble the right council over time. So I think that is going to be a process where the network has to decide what it wants, and stakeholders will have to collectively vote together, and they'll have to decide, are they going to make every member of the council like relatively economically aligned, in which case you will just not have developers participating on the same level, or do you want to bring in people from a diverse set of backgrounds or a diverse set of experiences? And I think if you do the latter, the network will naturally evolve in a way that like maximizes its own self-interest and supports the interests of stakeholders. And so the council serves as this sort of form of indirection that splits up and helps diffuse the coin holder-based voting system. And all the power there. The council will also evolve. If there's relatively few councilors, then they have more of an executive function, but as it grows to its full size, they operate collectively. There are a bunch of places where only a small set of councilors need to agree that something is a good idea in order to implement it. One of them is the Treasury, where you need 4 councilor support to disperse funds. This is something that I think will also evolve and may change a little bit as the network gets closer to launch. But that means that the council basically supports a much wider range of behaviors than if it were every expenditure needs to be passed by a majority vote. A couple of modules, I talked about signaling. The discussion is the last piece, and I think that is a completely off-chain piece. Knowing that there is a lot of friction around going through the processes of coin holder governance and bringing out your keys and being super deliberate about that process, we are fusing that along with the Commonwealth UI, with the chance for people to participate in a pretty off-chain basis in the governance of the network. So if you have a proposal and say you would like to request some funds, you don't need to go through and figure out who are the important stakeholders and go and contact them directly. You can go to one place and say, I'm interested in assembling a proposal for X, Y, or Z. Can people just come and show up and tell me what you think? And that essentially should lower the barrier to entry to governance by a pretty big amount. So I think in a lot of governance talks, there's like a part in the beginning where you kind of outline your philosophy about governance, and you talk for like 5 minutes or so about what you think the definition of governance is. We don't really have that. We have, I guess, a look back at the modules and kind of this like retrospective where we look at what we've put together and kind of derive like what kind of principles have been guiding how it works. So I'm just going to kind of do that. Complex systems are complex. You can't predict how they'll behave at this stage. It's much better to lay a lot of stuff out and let them evolve and basically set good default parameters. You want people to be able to participate in the system without depending on other people, so they can act independently. This is in opposition to a lot of thinking around consensus, where a group needs to arrive at consensus to do something. As much as possible, you want to lower the barrier to entry to that. Build around a simple core mechanism for us, that's coin voting and figuring out how to overcome its deficits and trade-offs, checks and balances. You want your governance process to include you want to be fairly thorough in what you bake into governance supporting, so that way people don't end up depending on something that's outside of the governance process, and that forms like different centers of power. And so I guess to wrap all of that up, what does a successful launch and successful governance of this network look like? We would love to see this be the baseline for a huge number of developers and community members onboarding themselves. Solid discussions, the network successfully funding important apps and upgrades. I think that is high participation in voting. Resilience against forks, settling disputes. Like this is also an experimental network, and so over time we'll see how it evolves. But I think the community has a huge stake in it, and so it will adapt along with everybody's self-interest. All right, that's all I've got.